You can begin when we're recording now. I'm going to mute. Please begin when you're ready, Michael.
Hello, my name is Michael Fenn. I'm one of the contributors to the research project that you're here to learn more about. I was asked to talk about the impact of major trends in society and the economy as it would affect rural development in Ontario. I've been doing work along with a number of other people on some of these major trends. They're often referred to as megatrends. So this presentation looks at the impact of megatrends on rural development in Ontario, and it aims to demonstrate that by looking into the future, we can make greater progress available to Ontario's rural communities. The first thing about megatrends is that there is a variety of opinion on what those trends are. There are different lists that are prepared by different researchers and futurists and those that look at these kinds of issues. I think there are 6 that really bear the greatest attention. Of course, this isn't predicting the future. It's really identifying trends that will influence the future, and a lot of the implications are, to some extent, left to your own ideas about what will be important going forward. We tend not to look very far forward for reasons that will be familiar to anyone who looks back, say, 15 or 20 years, so that how far in advance of developments we can predict is certainly limited. But looking at the 6 megatrends that we've identified in the paper, they begin with technology. Most of the trends related to infrastructure, and that's the primary focus of this discussion, are related to technology. And that's because at its essence, infrastructure is all about technology. But the significant trend is really not so much the introduction of new technologies and the expansion of technological change as the pace of that change, which in our view has accelerated considerably and will continue to accelerate in the foreseeable future. The second big trend is urbanization, globalization, and particularly connectivity. The third is social and demographic trends. The fourth is changes that will likely take place in the workplace and in the economy more broadly as a result of trends that can be identified now. Then next are environmental trends, particularly focusing on the impact of climate change and energy issues. And then finally, wrapping it all up, are the trends in political decision-making and fiscal status of governments at all levels, and the degree to which they influence both the trends themselves and the infrastructure that we are looking at. So the focus is really at 2 things: looking at megatrends and the impact that they have or will have on rural infrastructure, and then secondly, recognizing that infrastructure itself will have an impact on rural society and the rural economy. If we start off at looking at the future of rural Ontario through this megatrends lens, the first thing that is identified is the world of rural Ontario will certainly shrink. We'll see reductions in distances and elapsed times, scale, business margins, including intermediaries. We're going to see a range of functions converge. Things that used to be freestanding and separate will increasingly come together. You'll see more individual customization and more customer-driven community planning in our communities and across our regions of rural Ontario. Global impacts are going to become local impacts, and that will mean that the world will come to your door, but also that rural Ontario needs to consider the broader global economy and the trends that are related to globalization. We think that there are important developments as a result of climate change and severe weather, but whether its consequences will be accepted will depend on people's willingness to adapt. Demographics are going to be an important ingredient, and not just the ones that we conventionally think about, like aging or youth employment, but also the changing complexion of rural Ontario as waves of immigration affect Canada in the future and will increasingly affect rural Ontario. And then finally, as I mentioned, there are political and economic issues, and one of the most significant is short-term thinking, which potentially affects progress and sustainability, and both in the economy more broadly and business and enterprise. Short-term thinking is influencing willingness to invest and look over the long term, and that's certainly true in the political context, where social media and the exigencies of a 4-year electoral term make longer-term thinking, which is crucial for infrastructure planning and implementation, often difficult to undertake. Well, as a result of looking at these issues, we came to the conclusion that there are several things that are really of particular interest, highlights that one might consider. The first is that we are going to see significant changes in the technologies associated with transportation, whether it's road, air, or rail, and these are going to make long distance, lower cost, more rapid and dependable commuting in all weather much more likely prospect than it has been up till now. One of the big issues facing rural Ontario is, of course, isolation and the implications of being at distance from major urban centers. These things may change. On one hand, we're going to see much more reliance on the digital economy, which really doesn't care about distance or size of markets. It treats all interactions in roughly the same fashion, and that is a particular advantage in rural Ontario. But in the more conventional forms of transportation and communication, there are technologies that are being developed and are on the horizon that will mean that the opportunity to live and work in rural areas or between rural areas and urban areas will become much more feasible than it has been in the past. And that will mean things like out-migration into second-tier urban centers in rural Ontario, or into out of major urban centers into regions that perhaps have not been as prosperous in the past or are reinventing their local economies. We're going to see the next round of infrastructure is going to be feature new, light, more adaptable infrastructure. That's things that are on the near-term horizon, like the expansion of broadband infrastructure. But we're also going to see infrastructure that's designed not to last for a half century, but capable of being adapted and repurposed as demands and technologies evolve. A much more emphasis on willingness to pay for the infrastructure that you use, but in part because of the fiscal constraints that are going to apply in particularly in municipal governments going forward. But we'll also see with the meshing of growth in immigration, a more fully utilized infrastructure, making it much more likely to be able to be financed on a user pay basis. The third trend that we think is potentially quite significant is looking at global trends as they apply to rural Ontario. There are going to be opportunities to look at the world markets that up till now have not been accessible, and that many of the existing relationships are going to be affected by changes in trade policy and in e-commerce and a desire to have surety of quality and things of that kind. So we're going to see a lot of that. That's not necessarily always positive. It could affect things like supply management, and it might be affected by trade barriers in some areas. But all of these things in combination mean that the market for goods and services from rural Ontario may become more attractive to a broader audience, but also there'll be a need to find ways to access those markets. And then finally, demographics. As the cost of housing goes up, as immigration to support a number of necessary talent categories in our economy, the general growth of the population will mean that people will look to rural Ontario as an opportunity to find more attractive lifestyles, more competitively priced housing, more opportunities in facilities that aren't as crowded as those in the metropolitan centers. And those things will combine to potentially revitalize the rural downtowns and make local infrastructure more viable because of population growth. But it will also have an impact in the sense that you will be introducing into those communities people who are not part of the traditional population and may not be inclined to support the kinds of activities that were supported in the past, and maybe looking for new ways in which to integrate into the community and new opportunities, and creating some new dynamism and some new areas of focus for our rural centers. So what would we likely see next? One of the things that we're probably going to see is a greater role for the private sector. We're going to see more rural entrepreneurs rather than major employers as the source of employment in rural, urban, and smaller urban centers in rural Ontario. There's going to be much more of an emphasis by the public authorities in looking at public-private partnerships, particularly for major challenges like rebuilding the bridge infrastructure or things like our water and wastewater systems. I think we're going to see a recognition that the public sector leadership, elected leadership and municipal staff are stretched pretty thin in this kind of a world, and there's going to be a need to involve more members of the community in sharing community leadership. We have in some of the other papers a discussion about the role of volunteerism and the role of rural institutions, and these are going to need to evolve, and there's going to be a need to recognize that the municipal sector may have been in the leadership position in the past, but increasingly it's going to be asked to steer rather than row. It's not going to be able to do everything, but it can perhaps convene work that needs to be undertaken by a community as a whole to reinvigorate itself or to achieve strategic objectives. It may involve letting go in some areas and letting other organizations and other modes of delivery provide services to rural communities, a much more focus on a regional approach rather than a local approach, and that will apply not just to public services, but to the role of the private sector and not-for-profit organizations as they come together to share economic and community strategies going forward. So those are the highlights of the paper, and I'd certainly encourage those who are interested in these topics to take the time to go through it in a little bit more detail than I've been able to do here, because I think there are really some significant opportunities and some significant challenges associated with the impact of megatrends on infrastructure and the way in which infrastructure in rural Ontario will respond to those trends, and in many ways determine the future and the character of the rural economy and of rural society as a whole. Thanks.